When we think of the Ottoman Empire, images of powerful epic battles, magnificent mosques, and a vibrant culture often come to mind. For over 600 years, this empire spanned 3 continents, leaving a legacy that still fascinates us today. We picture the grandeur of the Topkapi Palace, the bustling markets of Istanbul, and the talis of sultans and their harems. But beneath this glittering surface of power and splendor lies a darker, more complex reality, a story that history has often preferred to keep in the shadows. This is the story of the Ottoman male concubines, a chapter deliberately silenced and largely forgotten. Their lives, spent within the gilded cages of the palace, were marked by a suffering that was considered unremarkable in its time but is deeply shocking to our modern sensibilities. This is not a tale of imperial glory. It's a narrative of fear, exploitation, and lost humanity, hidden behind the very walls that symbolized Ottoman greatness. To understand this story, we must first look at the social structure of the Ottoman court. A key institution was the devrim system. This was essentially a boy levy, where Christian boys from the empire's Balkan territories were taken from their families. These boys were forcibly converted to Islam and then trained for various roles within the state. The most talented and physically impressive were selected for the Enderun, the palace school inside Topkapi. Here, they received an elite education, learning everything from arts and sciences to military strategy and administration. They were destined to become the empire's future leaders, viziers, generals, and high-ranking officials. They were known as Ikoklanlari, or boys of the interior. While the devrim system is often presented as a path to power and privilege, for many, it was the beginning of a life devoid of personal freedom. Their old lives, their families, and their faiths were erased. Their new existence was entirely at the mercy of the sultan and the palace hierarchy. It was within this environment of total control and dependency that the practice of using these boys as concubines took root. So, how did these highly educated and promising young men end up in such a vulnerable position? The answer lies in the unique culture of the Enderun school and the absolute power of the sultan. The boys of the Enderun lived in a completely isolated, male environment. For centuries, a culture of homoeroticism and pederasty was not just tolerated, but was an open secret within the palace walls. Poetry and literature from the era often celebrated the beauty of young men, and these sentiments were reflected in the court's social dynamics. The sultans, as absolute rulers, held the power of life and death over everyone in their domain. Their desires were law. Many sultans, including some of the most famous, like Mehmed the Conqueror, were known to have male lovers. Historical accounts and chronicles, though often written in coded language, describe how sultans would select the most attractive Ikoklanlari for their personal service, which extended into their private chambers. These boys, often just teenagers, were chosen for their beauty and charm. They were given special privileges, adorned in fine clothes and jewels, and were part of the sultan's intimate circle. These favored boys were sometimes called Mabab, meaning the beloved. On the surface, their position might seem enviable. They were close to the center of power and enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle that others could only dream of. However, this proximity to the sultan was a double-edged sword. Their role was entirely dependent on the sultan's favor, which could be as fleeting as it was intense. They had no agency, no right to refuse the sultan's advances. Their bodies and their lives were not their own. They were objects of desire, disposable and replaceable. The psychological toll of this existence must have been immense. Stripped of their identity and forced into a role they did not choose, they lived in a constant state of anxiety. Jealousy and rivalry were rampant among the Ikoklanlari, as each one vied for the sultan's attention, knowing that falling out of favor could mean a loss of status, or worse. While some might have leveraged their position to gain influence, this was a dangerous game in the treacherous world of court politics. For most, it was a life of quiet desperation. The practice wasn't limited to just the sultans. High-ranking officials, pashas, and viziers, many of whom were themselves graduates of the Enderun school, often replicated the court's customs in their own households. They maintained their own retinues of young male pages, continuing the cycle of exploitation. This created a system where the abused could, in turn, become the abuser. Having experienced this life themselves, they saw it as a normal part of the power structure they now inhabited. This normalization is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire phenomenon. It was woven into the fabric of the Ottoman elite's social life, a custom passed down through generations of powerful men. It was hidden in plain sight, acknowledged in poetry and art, but never spoken of as the abuse that it was. The suffering of these boys was rendered invisible by the very culture that created it. They were trapped in a system that celebrated their beauty while simultaneously erasing their humanity. Life for a male concubine was precarious and often short-lived. Their value was tied directly to their youth and beauty. As they grew older and lost the physical attributes that had caught the Sultan's eye, they would typically be pensioned off. This meant they were married to women, often daughters of influential families, and given positions in the provincial administration, far away from the capital. This was called kikim. It was a way of removing them from the palace and integrating them back into the heterosexual norms of the wider society. For some, this might have been a release, a chance to start a new life. But for many, the psychological scars would have remained. They were forced to suppress their past and conform to a new identity, carrying the weight of their experiences in silence. Their stories were effectively erased, their pasts The system was designed to leave no trace of their true role in the palace. There were no official records of their duties, no memoirs detailing their suffering. Their history exists only in fragments in suggestive poems, cryptic court records, and the accounts of foreign visitors who were both fascinated and horrified by what they witnessed. So why don't we hear more about this? There are several reasons for this historical silence. Firstly, the topic has long been considered taboo, both within Turkish society and among Western historians. For a long time, writing the history of the Ottoman Empire was about celebrating its military and political achievements. Acknowledging the darker aspects of court life was seen as tarnishing this glorious image. Secondly, the evidence is difficult to piece together. As mentioned, the practice was an open secret, not an official institution. Records are indirect and often euphemistic. Historians have had to read between the lines of poetry, legal documents, and personal letters to reconstruct this hidden world. Lastly, modern sensibilities play a huge role. It's a deeply uncomfortable subject that challenges our romanticized views of the past. It forces us to confront the fact that historical figures we admire may have participated in practices we now find abhorrent. It's easier to focus on battles and architecture than on the systematic exploitation of children. But ignoring this part of history does a great disservice to the victims and gives us an incomplete, sanitized picture of the Ottoman world. It is crucial to understand that we are not judging the past by today's standards simply to condemn it. We are doing it to understand the full complexity of human history. The story of the Ottoman male concubines reveals the stark realities of absolute power and the ways in which institutions can be used to legitimize and perpetuate abuse. It reminds us that behind the grand narratives of empires and dynasties, there are always individual human stories of pain, resilience, and survival that are often left untold. The silence surrounding these boys is a testament to their powerlessness. They had no voice in their own time, and for centuries, history denied them one as well. By bringing their story to light, we are not trying to diminish the achievements of the Ottoman Empire. Instead, we are striving for a more honest and complete understanding of it. We are acknowledging that the foundations of that grand palace were, for some, built on a bedrock of silent suffering. Their story is a powerful reminder that history should not just be about the victors and the powerful, but also about the forgotten and the silenced. Thank you for joining me on this journey into a lesser-known chapter of Ottoman history. It's a difficult topic, but an important one. If you found this exploration insightful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of the past. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Have you ever pictured the opulent halls of the Ottoman Empire's Topkapi Palace? Visions of powerful sultans, lavish silks, and intricate politics often come to mind. But there's a lesser-known, more complex chapter of this history that unfolded within those very walls. A story about a group of young men whose lives were entirely dedicated to the service of the Sultan. These were the male concubines, and their world was one of strict rules, hidden duties, and a complete lack of personal freedom. Let's peel back the layers of this fascinating and often misunderstood aspect of Ottoman court life. First, it's crucial to understand who these individuals were. They weren't simply servants who could come and go. Many were acquired through the Devyarm system, A levy where young boys from Christian families in the Balkan territories were taken, converted to Islam, and trained for state service. Others were captives of war or were purchased from slave markets. From a very young age, they were considered the property of the state or the Sultan himself. Their previous identities, families, and homes were erased, replaced by a new life defined by absolute loyalty to the Ottoman throne. Their journey began at the Erasure School, a prestigious academy located right inside the Topkapi Palace. This wasn't just any school. It was an elite institution designed to create the perfect servants and administrators for the empire. Here, these boys, known as Ikoklani, or boys of the interior, underwent rigorous training. They studied subjects like literature, calligraphy, music, and the Quran. They also learned Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, but the most important lesson was obedience. They were taught to be completely devoted, discreet, and unquestioningly loyal to the Sultan. Their entire existence was engineered to serve his needs and protect his secrets. Once their training was complete, they were assigned various roles within the palace's inner sanctum. The palace was divided into public and private sections, and these young men were confined to the most exclusive areas, far from public view. Some of the most trusted and skilled individuals were chosen to serve in the Hazoda, or the Privy Chamber. This was the Sultan's personal living quarters, the very heart of his private world. Here, their duties were incredibly intimate and varied. They would help the Sultan dress, prepare his coffee, manage his personal library, and even hold his turban. They were the keepers of his immediate environment, ensuring his comfort and safety around the clock. Their proximity to the Sultan gave them a unique, albeit powerless, position. They heard state secrets and observed the Sultan's private moments, making their discretion paramount. Beyond the Privy Chamber, others served as guards in sensitive areas of the palace. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were highly trained guards who protected the royal family's private spaces. Their presence ensured that no unauthorized person could enter the secluded world of the Sultan and his household. They were a silent, watchful presence, embodying the control and security that defined the inner court. Their role was a constant reminder that the palace was a fortress, both physically and socially, and they were its internal gatekeepers. The concept of freedom as we know it today simply did not exist for them. They were owned. They could not leave the palace grounds without permission, which was rarely, if ever, granted. They had no right to marry, start a family, or pursue their own ambitions. Their lives were meticulously planned and controlled by palace officials. Every aspect of their day, from what they wore to what they ate, was dictated by protocol. This complete lack of autonomy was the price of their position within the glittering cage of the palace. They lived in a world of immense wealth and power, but none of it was their own. They were observers, not participants in the grand drama of the empire. Now, we have to address a sensitive but important part of their story. The term concubine itself often implies a personal, intimate relationship, and historical sources suggest that, for some, this was indeed the case. The private chambers of the palace were a world unto themselves, and the power dynamics were extreme. The Sultan's authority was absolute, given their youth, beauty, and constant proximity to the ruler. Some of these young men were chosen for their looks and charm, and were expected to provide companionship and entertainment. This could include musical performances, reciting poetry, or simply being a pleasant presence. The nature of these relationships was complex and subject to the Sultan's whims. It is a difficult topic to discuss because our modern understanding of consent and relationships doesn't neatly apply to a context where one person was considered property. These young men had no power to refuse any command. Their role was to please, in whatever form that took. Life in the palace was a hierarchy, and even among the Ikoklani, there was a strict system of ranks. A young man could, through skill, loyalty, and perhaps the favor of the Sultan, rise through the ranks within the palace service. The highest position one could hope to attain was to become a high-ranking official, or Uga. The Siladar Uga, for example, was the Sultan's sword-bearer, a position of great honor and trust. The Kuadaroga was in charge of the Sultan's outer garments. These roles came with significant influence within the court. Upon graduating from the Erasure school, or after years of service, some were appointed to powerful administrative or military positions outside the palace, becoming governors or generals. This was the ultimate reward for a lifetime of perfect service. They would finally gain a measure of freedom and power, becoming part of the Empire's ruling elite. However, this path was only open to a select few. For most, their entire lives would be spent within the gilded confines of the palace walls. The world of the male concubine was one of profound contradictions. They were surrounded by unimaginable luxury but possessed nothing. They were privy to the greatest secrets of the empire, but had no voice of their own. They were educated and skilled, but had no personal ambition. Their story is a powerful reminder of the extreme power imbalances that existed in the Ottoman court. It challenges our romanticized visions of palace life and forces us to look at the human cost of such a system. These were not just nameless, faceless servants. They were individuals whose lives were shaped, controlled, and ultimately consumed by the institution they served. Their history is a quiet but essential part of the grand, complex tapestry of the Ottoman Empire. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a hidden corner of history. If you found this topic as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that you won't find in the usual textbooks. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Have you ever heard of the Devshirme system? It's a dark and often overlooked chapter in the history of the Ottoman Empire, and it's a story of stolen childhoods and shattered families. Imagine this. You're a young Christian boy, living a simple life in a quiet village somewhere in the Balkans. One day, without any warning, Ottoman officials arrive. They are here for one reason: to take boys. This was the Devshirme, or the blood tax. These officials would inspect the village boys, looking for the strongest, the healthiest, and the most intelligent. If you were chosen, that was it. Your life as you knew it was over. You were taken from your parents, often by force. Can you imagine the scene? The desperation in your mother's eyes, the helplessness on your father's face. Resistance was futile. It would only bring harsh punishment upon your family and your entire village. So you were torn away, a child, surrounded by strangers, heading towards a future you couldn't possibly comprehend. For the boys, this journey was terrifying. They were marched for weeks, sometimes months, to the heart of the empire, Istanbul. Many were just 8 years old. Some were as old as 20, but most were in their early teens. They didn't speak the language, they didn't know the culture, and they had no idea what awaited them. They had lost everything: their family, their home, their faith, and even their names. This was the start of a complete and total transformation. Once they arrived in Istanbul, the process of indoctrination began. First, they were forcibly converted to Islam. This wasn't just a simple declaration. It was the stripping away of their entire spiritual identity. Their Christian names were replaced with Turkish or Arabic ones. This was the first step in severing every last tie to their past. Next, they were circumcised, a physical and symbolic marking of their new identity within the empire. Te werena in the eyes of the state, Muslims and subjects of the Sultan. Then came the rigorous education. The boys were sorted based on their abilities. The most brilliant, the ones who showed exceptional intelligence and aptitude, were sent to the elite palace schools. Here, they would study subjects like mathematics, literature, law, theology, and military strategy. They learned multiple languages, including Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. This education was world-class, designed to create the future leaders of the Ottoman Empire. They were being molded into a new elite, loyal only to the Sultan. The rest of the boys, the vast majority, were sent to serve with Turkish families or in the military. This was a form of apprenticeship. They would learn the Turkish language, the customs of the empire, and the hard realities of military life. This was the path to becoming a janissary, the elite infantry unit of the Ottoman army. The janissaries were renowned for their discipline, their loyalty, and their ferocity in battle. They were, in essence, a slave army, but one with immense power and prestige. Now, let's talk about the boys who were chosen for the palace schools. These were the ones destined for greatness, but their path was far from easy. They were called the Aikoklani, or inner boys. They lived and studied within the sprawling Topkapi Palace, the very center of Ottoman power. Their lives were a strange paradox. They were slaves, owned by the Sultan, yet they were also privileged. They received the best education, wore fine clothes, and ate well. But their freedom was non-existent. Their entire world was confined within the palace walls. The goal of this intensive training was to produce a class of administrators and officials who were utterly dependent on and loyal to the Sultan, because they had no family ties, no regional loyalties, and no inherited wealth. Their allegiance was supposed to be absolute. Their success, their very survival, depended on the Sultan's favor. Many of these boys would go on to become governors, viziers, and even the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful person in the empire. It was a remarkable, brutal system of social mobility. A poor Christian boy from a remote village could, in theory, rise to control the vast machinery of the state. But there was another, more hidden side to life in the palace. Among another selection process took place. The most physically attractive boys were often chosen for a very different role. They were destined to become part of the Sultan's personal retinue, serving him in the most intimate parts of the palace, the under-Yun, or the inner service. This is where the story takes a turn into a more sensitive and often sensationalized area. These handsome young men, sometimes called pages or squires, were not just there to serve food or carry messages. While historical sources can be discreet, it's widely understood by historians that many of these boys became the Sultan's concubines. They were chosen for their beauty, their grace, and their charm. They were taught to sing, to play music, to recite poetry, and to be witty conversation. Their job was to entertain, to please, and to be companions to the ruler of one of the world's most powerful empires. This practice might seem shocking to us today, but within the context of the Ottoman court, it was an established, if private, reality. The relationships between the Sultan and these young men were complex. They existed in a gray area of power, affection, and exploitation. For the boy, it could be a path to immense influence. A favorite of the Sultan could whisper in his ear, influencing decisions of state. They could gain wealth and power far beyond what they could have achieved through the normal administrative track. However, let's not romanticize this. These were still boys and young men who had been taken from their homes. They were in a position of complete vulnerability. The Sultan held the power of life and death over them. Their position was precarious, dependent entirely on the whims of one man. When a Sultan died, or when their beauty faded, their status could vanish in an instant. Some were pensioned off, some were given minor posts, but others simply disappeared from the historical record. It is also important to understand that this was unseen in the same way we might see it today. The concept of sexuality and relationships in the Ottoman court was different. Relationships between men, especially between an older, powerful man and a younger subordinate, were not uncommon in the elite circles of many pre-modern societies. In the context of the palace, it was another facet of the Sultan's absolute power and ownership over the people in his household. The lives of these male concubines were lived in the shadows of the harem. While we often think of the harem as exclusively female, the under-Yun school and the Sultan's private chambers were, in a sense, a male equivalent. It was a world of intense competition, jealousy, and intrigue. Pages would vie for the Sultan's attention, hoping to become a favorite. This competition wasn't just for affection, it was for survival and advancement. The Devshirme system itself began to decline in the 17th century. The Janissaries became too powerful, staging revolts and even deposing. They began to demand that their own sons be allowed to join their ranks, breaking the fundamental principle of the system. By the late 17th century, the practice of levying boys had largely ceased, and the system was officially abolished in the 19th century. But its legacy is profound. It created a unique ruling class that helped the Ottoman Empire function for centuries. It was a brutal, tragic system that destroyed countless families and stole the lives of thousands of children, but it also offered a bizarre and perilous path to power for a select few. The story of the Devshirme and the male concubines of the palace is a stark reminder of the complex and often cruel realities of power. It shows us a world where a child could be a slave, a student, a soldier, a statesman, and a companion to a king, all at the same time. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not for its glamour, but for its raw and often painful human cost. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the past. Let me know in the comments what you think about the DevSherm system. See you in the next video.